The rain fell hard against the windows of Crowford Manor the night Clara Hawthorne arrived. She stood in the grand foyer, water dripping from the hem of her travelling cloak, her hands folded neatly in front of her. The marble floors gleamed under the gaslight. Everything in this house was polished, cold, untouchable, just like the man waiting for her in the study. Clara had travelled for 2 days to reach this place. 2 days of rattling train cars and uncomfortable silence, clutching a single leather bag that held everything she owned now. Her mother had pressed a handkerchief into her palm before she left, embroidered with forget-me-nots. Clara could still feel the dampness of her mother's tears soaked into the fabric. A servant appeared beside her, an older woman with kind eyes and a stiff uniform. "Miss Hawthorne," the woman said softly, "Mr. Crowford is waiting for you in the study. May I take your cloak?" Clara nodded, allowing the woman to lift the heavy wool from her shoulders. Beneath it, she wore a simple travelling dress of deep blue, modest and worn at the cuffs. She was suddenly aware of how plain she must look in this palace of wealth. "This way, miss." Clara followed the servant down a long corridor, lined with oil paintings of stern-faced men and women. Crowford ancestors, she assumed. They all had the same dark eyes, the same unforgiving expressions. The study door was already open. Nathaniel Crowford didn't rise when she entered. He sat behind a mahogany desk that seemed too large for any conversation that mattered. His dark eyes tracked her movements as she crossed the room, measured, cautious, aware of every step she took. He was younger than she'd imagined. She'd built him up in her mind as some ancient tyrant, but the man before her couldn't have been much older than 30. His face was handsome in a severe way, all sharp angles and controlled composure. His suit was impeccable, his posture perfect. Everything about him spoke of discipline. "Miss Hawthorne," he said. His voice was low, controlled. "I trust your journey was uneventful." "It was long," Clara replied quietly. He gestured to the chair across from him. She sat, smoothing her skirt with careful hands. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Nathaniel reached into a drawer and withdrew a leather-bound document. He placed it on the desk between them, his movements precise. "This is the agreement your father signed before his death," he said. "It stipulates that in exchange for settling his debts to my steel company, you would become my wife. The marriage will last 1 year. After that, you are free to leave, with a modest allowance that will ensure your independence." Clara's throat tightened. She'd known this was coming. She'd read the letter her father left behind, seen the numbers written in shaking script. He'd gambled everything on a railroad investment that never came. And when the creditors circled, Nathaniel Crowford had offered a way out. Not out of kindness, out of necessity. "The debts totaled $43,000, Nathaniel continued, his tone matter-of-fact. "Your family home was mortgaged twice over. Your mother's inheritance was already spent. Without intervention, you would have lost everything within 3 months. Clara flinched at the stark honesty of it. "I understand," she said. "Do you?" Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, studying her with those dark, unreadable eyes. "This is not a love match, Miss Hawthorne. It's a transaction. I need a wife to satisfy certain social expectations. You need your family's name protected from scandal. We both gain something. But don't mistake this for anything more than what it is." Clara met his gaze. There was no warmth there, no softness, just calculation. "I won't," she said. "Good." He slid the contract toward her, along with a fountain pen. "The terms are straightforward. You will live here as my wife. You will attend necessary social functions. You will conduct yourself with dignity and discretion. In return, your family's debts will be cleared. Your mother and sister will receive a monthly stipend, and after 1 year, you will be free to go with $10,000 to start a new life." $10,000. It was more money than Clara had ever dreamed of having. It was also a price for her freedom. Her hand trembled as she picked up the pen. She glanced down at the neat, unforgiving lines of legal text. 1 year, 365 days. She could survive 1 year. She signed her name. Nathaniel took the document back without a word. He folded it carefully, sealed it with red wax, and locked it in the drawer. "The wedding will be next week," he said. "Small, private. My attorney will handle the details. You'll need appropriate clothing. I've arranged for a dressmaker to visit tomorrow." "That's very kind," Clara said softly. "It's practical," Nathaniel corrected. "You'll be representing me. That requires a certain standard." Clara nodded, swallowing the sting of his words. "And after the wedding?" she asked quietly. "After, you'll live here. You'll have your own rooms, your own space. You'll attend the necessary social functions, dinners, benefits, the occasional ball. You'll behave as my wife in public." He paused, his expression unreadable. "In private, we maintain our distance." Clara nodded. It was exactly what she expected, exactly what the contract promised. She rose to leave, but his voice stopped her at the door. "One more thing." She turned. Nathaniel's eyes were darker now, shadowed by something she couldn't name. "Don't try to change me, Miss Hawthorne. And don't expect me to change you. We are what we are. This arrangement works best if we remember that." Clara held his gaze for a long moment. She saw the wall he'd built around himself, brick by careful brick. She wondered what had made him this way, what had turned him so cold. "I won't," she said softly. And she walked out into the cold, empty hallway of Crowford Manor, the place that would be her prison for the next 12 months. The servant who had greeted her earlier appeared again, her expression gentle. "Your rooms are prepared, miss. I'm Mrs. Vale, the housekeeper. If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." "Thank you," Clara said. Mrs. Vale led her up a grand staircase to the second floor. The hallway was wide and lined with more portraits, more stern faces watching her pass. "This will be your suite," Mrs. Vale said, opening a heavy oak door. Clara stepped inside and caught her breath. It was beautiful. A large bedroom with silk wallpaper in pale cream, a four-poster bed draped in soft linens, a sitting area with velvet chairs positioned near a fireplace. French doors opened onto a small balcony overlooking the estate gardens. "Mr. Crowford's rooms are at the other end of the hall," Mrs. Vale said quietly. "You'll have your privacy here." Clara nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Dinner is at 7, Mrs. Vale continued, "but if you'd prefer to rest tonight, I can have a tray sent up." "A tray would be lovely," Clara said. "Thank you." Mrs. Vale smiled kindly and left, closing the door softly behind her. Clara stood alone in the beautiful empty room. She walked to the balcony doors and looked out at the gardens below. Even in the fading light, she could see they were overgrown, wild. Roses tangled with ivy. Stone paths disappeared beneath creeping vines. It looked like something that had once been loved and then forgotten. She pressed her hand against the cold glass and closed her eyes. This was her life now, this bargain, this beautiful prison. She thought of her mother, relieved that the creditors would no longer come knocking. She thought of her sister Lillian, who could now afford her music lessons and her books. She thought of her father, dead 6 months, and the mess he'd left behind. And she thought of Nathaniel Crowford, sitting alone in his study, surrounded by contracts and numbers and everything he could control. A man who needed a wife but not a woman. A man who wanted distance but demanded presence. A man who had saved her family but felt nothing about it. Clara opened her eyes and stared out at the dying gardens. 1 year. She could do this for 1 year. The wedding took place on a grey morning in October. There were no flowers, no music, just a magistrate, 2 witnesses pulled from the staff, and vows spoken in clipped, emotionless tones. Clara wore a dress the dressmaker had completed just the night before. It was beautiful, cream silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, but it felt like a costume, like she was playing a part in someone else's story. Nathaniel stood beside her in a dark suit, his expression unreadable. When the magistrate asked if he took Clara to be his lawfully wedded wife, he said, "I do," with the same tone he might use to approve a business contract. When it was Clara's turn, her voice was barely a whisper. "I do." When Nathaniel placed the ring on her finger, his hand was steady. Clara's shook. The ring was gold, elegant, perfectly sized. She wondered how he'd known her measurement. Had he guessed? Had he asked Mrs. Vale to check while she slept? "By the power vested in me," the magistrate said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Nathaniel didn't kiss her. He simply nodded, signed the registry with firm, confident strokes and left the room. Clara stood there for a moment, staring down at the gold band on her finger. It felt heavier than it should. The witnesses offered quiet congratulations and slipped away, leaving Clara alone in the small parlour where the ceremony had taken place. She looked at her reflection in the mirror above the mantel. Mrs. Nathaniel Crowford, a steel magnate's wife, a woman of position and wealth. She looked like a stranger. That night, Clara sat alone in her bedroom. Mrs. Vale had helped her out of the wedding dress and into a simple nightgown. A fire crackled in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Clara sat in one of the velvet chairs, staring at the flames, trying to process everything that had happened. She was married, to a man she didn't know, a man who didn't want to know her. A soft knock at the door startled her. "Come in," she said. Nathaniel entered, still dressed in his evening clothes. He stood just inside the doorway, as if crossing the threshold any further would break some unspoken rule. "I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed," he said. "I do, thank you." He nodded. His gaze lingered on her for a moment, just long enough for Clara to notice the faint lines around his eyes, the tension in his jaw. He looked tired, not physically, but in some deeper way. "Good night, then," he said. "Good night." He turned to leave, but hesitated at the door. "Clara?" It was the first time he'd used her first name. She looked up, surprised. "This arrangement," he said quietly, his back still to her. "It doesn't have to be unbearable." Clara didn't know what to say to that. The words felt like an offering, fragile and uncertain. "I hope not," she said softly. Nathaniel nodded once, then left, closing the door gently behind him. Clara sat in the silence, staring at the ring on her finger, and she wondered for the first time if maybe, just maybe, Nathaniel Crowford wasn't as cold as he wanted the world to believe. If maybe, beneath all that control, all that distance, there was something human still left, something worth finding. The days at Crowford Manor followed a rhythm Clara learned quickly. Breakfast at 7 o'clock in the morning, Nathaniel read the financial papers, his coffee growing cold beside him as he marked notes in the margins with a silver pen. Clara drank her tea in silence, occasionally glancing at him over the rim of her cup. They spoke only when necessary. Past the butter. "Good morning. The weather looks fair today, thank you." Every word carefully measured, every silence carefully maintained. He left for his office downtown by 8 o'clock. The door would close. The carriage would pull away, and Clara would be alone until dinner. At first, Clara thought the solitude would suffocate her. The house was too large, too quiet, too filled with the ghosts of conversations that would never happen. She wandered the halls like a spirit herself, touching the expensive furniture, looking at the paintings, wondering about the lives of the people who had lived here before her. But slowly, she began to find her place. The library became her refuge. It was on the second floor, tucked away at the end of the east wing. The room stretched 2 stories high, with shelves upon shelves of leather-bound books, reaching toward an ornate ceiling painted with clouds and cherubs. A rolling ladder on brass rails allowed access to the higher shelves. 2 large windows overlooked the wild gardens below, letting in soft morning light. Clara spent hours there. She read Emerson, Hawthorne, Whitman. She found comfort in their words, in their questions about life and meaning and the human soul. She discovered a worn copy of Jane Eyre, and felt a kinship with the plain governess who had loved a difficult man. She found poetry that made her cry, philosophy that made her think, history that made her understand. Books became her companions in the silence. One afternoon, 3 weeks after the wedding, Clara was exploring a section of the library she hadn't visited before when she noticed a door she'd missed. It was tucked behind a tall shelf, barely visible unless you were looking for it. Curiosity pulled her forward. The door opened onto a hallway she didn't recognize. She followed it, her footsteps quiet on the Persian runner, until she reached another door at the end. She pushed it open and found a piano. The room was smaller than the library, more intimate. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight, streaming through tall windows. The walls were covered in pale blue silk, faded with age, and in the center of the room, covered with a white sheet, sat a grand piano. Clara approached it slowly, reverently. She lifted the sheet carefully, half expecting it to disintegrate in her hands, but the fabric was sturdy, just dusty. Beneath it, the piano gleamed. The wood was dark mahogany, polished to a mirror shine despite the years. The keys were ivory, yellowed slightly with age but still beautiful. Clara ran her fingers over them gently. They were slightly out of tune, but still responsive, still alive. She sat down on the bench. Her mother had taught her to play when she was young, before her father's gambling had forced them to sell their own piano. Clara hadn't touched keys in years, but her fingers remembered. They found their positions automatically, muscle memory stronger than time. She played a simple melody, something her mother had taught her, a lullaby, gentle and haunting. The notes filled the empty room, echoing off the silk walls. The sound was imperfect, slightly discordant from the poor tuning, but still achingly beautiful. Clara closed her eyes and let the music carry her away. For a moment, she wasn't in Crowford Manor. She wasn't Mrs. Nathaniel Crowford, trapped in a contract marriage. She was just Clara, playing for the joy of it, for the memory of her mother's smile, for the feeling of creating something beautiful in a world that often felt harsh. She didn't hear Nathaniel until he spoke. "I didn't know you played." Clara's hands froze mid-phrase. The last note hung in the air, then faded into silence. She turned quickly, her heart pounding. He stood in the doorway, his coat still on, his briefcase in one hand. He must have come home early. She had no idea how long he'd been standing there, listening. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, standing up from the bench. "I didn't mean to intrude. I was exploring, and I found this room, and I shouldn't have touched anything." "I can stop." "No." His voice was quiet but firm. "Don't stop." Clara hesitated, her hands twisting together nervously. Nathaniel set down his briefcase. He took off his coat slowly, draping it over a chair near the door. Then he walked into the room, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. "Please," he said, "keep playing." Clara looked at him, uncertain, but something in his expression made her sit back down at the bench. She turned back to the keys. She played again, slower this time, more careful. The same melody but softer now, more intimate. Nathaniel didn't leave. He stood a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the piano, or maybe on her hands, moving across the keys. Clara couldn't tell. When she finished, the silence felt different. Not empty, not uncomfortable, just full of something unspoken. "My mother used to play," Nathaniel said finally. Clara looked at him. For the first time since she'd arrived at Crowford Manor, she saw something other than distance in his eyes. Something raw, something real. "She played every day," he continued, his voice low. "In the morning, after breakfast. In the evening, before dinner. She said it helped her think, helped her feel." "She sounds wonderful," Clara said softly. She was. Nathaniel's gaze drifted to the piano, distant now, lost in memory. "She died when I was 12 years old. Pneumonia. It happened quickly. One week she was fine, laughing, playing. The next week she was gone." "I'm so sorry," Clara said. The words felt inadequate, but she meant them. "This was her piano," Nathaniel said. "I haven't heard it played in 20 years. Clara's breath caught. 20 years of silence. 20 years of this beautiful instrument covered and forgotten. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I shouldn't have—" "I'm glad you did," Nathaniel interrupted. He looked at her then, really looked at her. "I'd forgotten what it sounded like." Clara didn't know what to say. She could see the grief in his eyes, old and deep, the kind of grief that never fully heals, just becomes part of who you are. Nathaniel stepped closer to the piano, his hand reaching out to brush along the edge, the same way Clara had when she'd first uncovered it. "She used to say music was the only honest language," he said quietly, "that words could lie, hide, deceive, but notes couldn't. Music told the truth of what you felt, even when you couldn't say it out loud." Clara watched him, this man who kept everyone at arm's length, who measured every word, who controlled every expression, and she saw the 12-year-old boy he'd been, standing in this room listening to his mother play, not knowing those would be the last songs he'd ever hear her perform. "Do you believe that?" Clara asked gently. "That music is honest?" Nathaniel's hand stilled on the piano. He was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know what I believe anymore," he said finally. The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and vulnerable. He looked at her then, and Clara felt something shift. The distance that had been between them since the moment they met seemed to narrow just slightly. Not gone, but less absolute, less permanent. "You play beautifully," Nathaniel said. "I'm out of practice," Clara said, "and the piano needs tuning." "I'll have someone come tomorrow," Nathaniel said immediately, "to tune it properly." "You don't have to—" "I want to," he met her eyes. "Play whenever you like, Clara. This room is yours now." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. It was such a simple gesture, but it meant everything. He was giving her something, not out of obligation or contract, but because he wanted to. "Thank you," she whispered. Nathaniel nodded once, then stepped back. The moment passed. The walls came back up, brick by careful brick. "Dinner will be ready soon," he said, his voice returning to that measured, controlled tone. "I'll be down shortly," Clara said. Nathaniel picked up his coat and briefcase and left without another word. Clara sat at the piano for a long time after he was gone, staring at the keys, her heart beating faster than it should. Something had changed, something small, but significant, and Clara didn't know if that terrified her or gave her hope. The next morning there was a letter waiting for her at breakfast. It sat beside her plate, the envelope addressed in familiar handwriting. Clara recognized it immediately. Her younger sister, Lillian. She opened it carefully, aware of Nathaniel watching her from behind his newspaper. "Dearest Clara, I hope this letter finds you well and happy. We received your note about the wedding. Mama is so relieved. She's been sleeping better now, eating more. The worry was killing her, Clara. You saved us, but I need to know that you're truly all right. I know why you did this. I know what father's debts cost us. But I can't help worrying about you. Are you safe? Are you treated well? Does he hurt you? Please write to me soon. Tell me everything. Tell me you're not suffering. Your loving sister, Lillian. Clara folded the letter carefully, her chest tight. Lillian was only 17, too young to carry the weight of worry, but old enough to understand what their father's death had cost them all. Safe. Lillian wanted to know if she was safe. Clara glanced at Nathaniel. He had lowered his newspaper slightly, watching her with those dark, unreadable eyes. Everything all right? He asked. Yes, Clara said. Just a letter from my sister. Nathaniel nodded and returned to his reading. Clara took a sip of her tea, gathering courage. Nathaniel. He looked up again, surprised. She rarely initiated conversation. Yes? Would it be all right if my sister visited? Just for a few days. I know it wasn't in the contract, but I thought, of course, Nathaniel said, cutting off her rambling. This is your home too, Clara. Your family is welcome here. The words stunned her into silence. Your home. He'd said it so casually, as if it were obvious, as if she truly belonged here, not just as a contractual obligation, but as a person with rights and space and agency. Thank you, Clara said softly. Nathaniel studied her for a moment, then returned to his paper, but Clara noticed the slightest softening around his eyes. Not quite a smile, but close. That evening, Clara found Nathaniel in his study. The door was open, and she could see him bent over a massive desk covered in papers and ledgers. His sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, his collar loosened. Ink stained his fingers. He looked exhausted. Clara knocked softly on the doorframe. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said. You're not, Nathaniel said without looking up. What do you need? I wanted to thank you again for letting Lillian visit. Nathaniel set down his pen. He finally looked at her, and Clara saw the weariness in his eyes. How many hours had he been working? How long had he been sitting in this chair, managing his empire, carrying the weight of hundreds of employees and investors and contracts? You don't need to thank me for basic decency, Clara, he said. Maybe not, she said, but I will anyway. Something flickered in his expression, the ghost of a smile. You're stubborn, he said. So are you, Clara replied. This time, he did smile. Just barely, just enough for Clara to see the man beneath the armor. Taushe, he said. Clara stepped into the study, her courage building. She'd been thinking about this all day, ever since the moment in the music room, ever since she'd seen that flash of humanity in his eyes. Can I ask you something? She said. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, studying her. Go ahead. Why did you really agree to this arrangement? You could have had any woman in New York, someone from your world, someone who understood society, who knew how to navigate that life, someone who fit. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. He picked up his pen, rolling it between his fingers absently. Because women from my world want something I can't give, he said finally. What's that? He met her eyes. Love. The word fell between them like a stone dropping into still water. The ripples spread outward, changing everything. Clara's heart ached. Not for herself, for him. And you think I don't want that? She asked softly. Nathaniel set down the pen. I think you understand the difference between what we want and what we need, he said, and that makes you rare. Most people spend their whole lives chasing what they want, destroying themselves and everyone around them in the process. But you made a choice based on what was necessary, what was right for your family. That takes strength. That takes clarity. He paused, his expression softening just slightly. I respected that, he said. I still do. Clara felt tears burning behind her eyes. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. No one had ever seen her choice as anything other than desperate or tragic. But Nathaniel saw it as strong. Thank you, she whispered. Nathaniel nodded once, then gestured to the papers on his desk. I should get back to this. The steel contracts don't review themselves. Of course, Clara said. Good night, Nathaniel. Good night, Clara. She turned to leave, but paused at the door. Nathaniel? Yes? You're not as cold as you pretend to be. He looked at her, startled. Clara smiled gently. Just thought you should know. And she left him there, alone in his study, surrounded by papers and numbers and everything he could control. But as she climbed the stairs to her room, Clara realized something important. She was starting to see the man beneath the empire. The boy who had lost his mother. The man who had built walls to protect himself. The person who believed love was something he couldn't give because no one had ever taught him how. And that terrified her, because she was starting to care, and caring was the one thing the contract hadn't prepared her for. Lillian arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, stepping out of the carriage like a burst of sunlight breaking through grey clouds. She wore a simple dress of pale yellow, her dark hair pinned up loosely, a few rebellious curls framing her face. At 17, she still had that brightness in her eyes that the world hadn't yet dimmed. Clara ran down the front steps, forgetting propriety, forgetting her role as Mrs. Crowford. She was just a sister again. They collided in an embrace, holding each other so tightly Clara could barely breathe. "You look well," Lillian said, pulling back to study Clara's face with worried eyes. "Thinner, maybe, but well." "I'm fine," Clara said, smiling through sudden tears. "Really, I'm fine." Lillian didn't look entirely convinced, but she smiled anyway, that radiant smile that had always been her gift. Mrs. Vale appeared to help with the luggage, and Clara led Lillian inside, giving her a tour of the grand rooms she'd come to know over the past month. "It's beautiful," Lillian breathed, staring up at the painted ceiling in the entrance hall. "Like a palace. It's very large," Clara said carefully. "And very empty," Lillian observed quietly. Clara said nothing. That evening, Nathaniel joined them for dinner. Clara had been nervous about this moment, wondering how he would be with her sister, whether the careful politeness they'd developed would extend to guests. But Nathaniel surprised her. He greeted Lillian warmly, pulling out her chair, asking about her journey, making genuine conversation. His manners were impeccable, his attention focused. He made Lillian feel welcome. "So, Mr. Crowford," Lillian said brightly, cutting into her roasted duck. "Clara tells me you own a significant portion of the steel production on the eastern seaboard. That must be absolutely fascinating." "It's profitable," Nathaniel said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "But is it fulfilling?" Lillian asked, tilting her head. Nathaniel paused, his fork hovering in mid-air. Clara held her breath, worried her sister had overstepped. But Nathaniel considered the question seriously. "I've never thought about it that way," he admitted. Lillian grinned, that mischievous spark in her eyes that Clara knew well. "Maybe you should." Nathaniel glanced at Clara, and she saw something there. Not irritation, something closer to appreciation. "Your sister is quite direct," he said. "She always has been," Clara replied. After dinner, Lillian pulled Clara aside in the hallway, her expression suddenly serious. "He's not what I expected," she whispered. "What did you expect?" Clara asked. "A monster," Lillian said frankly. "Mama made him sound like some cold-hearted industrialist who bought you like property. But he's just sad." Clara's throat tightened. "I know. Do you love him?" Lillian asked quietly. The question caught Clara off guard. "It's not that kind of marriage." "That's not what I asked." Clara looked away. "I don't know him well enough to love him." "But you want to know him," Lillian said. It wasn't a question. Clara didn't answer. She didn't need to. The next morning, Clara found Nathaniel in the library. It was unusual. He was normally at his office by this hour, but there he sat, reading in the leather armchair by the window, morning light falling across the pages. Clara recognized the book immediately. Walden, by Thoreau. She'd left it on the side table 2 days ago. "I didn't know you read philosophy," Clara said from the doorway. Nathaniel looked up, slightly embarrassed at being caught. "I don't, usually," he said. "But you left this here, and I was curious what you found so compelling about a man who lived alone in the woods." Clara smiled, stepping into the room. "What do you think?" "I think Thoreau never ran a steel company," Nathaniel said dryly. "It's easy to simplify life when you don't have 300 employees depending on you for their livelihoods." Clara laughed, a real, honest laugh. It surprised both of them. The sound seemed to fill the quiet library, warm and unexpected. Nathaniel's expression softened. "You should do that more often." "What?" "Laugh," he said. Clara's smile faded, but gently. "So should you." Nathaniel held her gaze for a long moment. Something passed between them, unspoken but real. Then he stood, setting the book aside carefully. "Walk with me?" he asked. Clara blinked. "Where?" "The gardens. I haven't been out there in years." It wasn't a command, it was an invitation, an offering. "All right," Clara said. They walked in silence at first. The gardens were overgrown but still beautiful, roses tangled with ivy, their late-season blooms scattered among thorns. Stone paths cracked by time and weather disappeared beneath creeping vines. The air smelled like rain and earth and autumn decay. "My mother loved these gardens," Nathaniel said, pausing near a stone bench half hidden beneath vegetation. "She spent every morning out here, planning, planting, talking to the flowers like they were friends." "You loved her very much," Clara said quietly. "I did." Nathaniel stared at the bench. "When she died, I didn't know how to grieve. My father told me to bury it. Focus on the business, become strong. Crying was weakness, missing her was weakness. But you weren't weak," Clara said gently. You were just a boy. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. I became what I needed to be. And what was that? Untouchable. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with years of isolation. Clara stepped closer, her heart aching for the child he'd been, the man he'd become. You don't have to be untouchable with me, she said softly. Nathaniel looked down at her. For a moment the walls dropped. She saw fear there, vulnerability, longing. He reached out slowly, his hand covering hers where it rested on her skirt. Clara, A sharp voice cut through the moment like a knife. Nathaniel! They both turned. A man strode toward them through the gardens, tall and impeccably dressed. His suit was expensive, his shoes polished. But there was something predatory in his eyes, something calculating in his smile. Silas, Nathaniel said, his tone instantly cold. He dropped Clara's hand. Silas Langford, Nathaniel's business partner. Clara had met him once at a dinner party shortly after the wedding. She hadn't liked him then. She liked him less now. I apologize for the intrusion, Silas said, though his tone suggested he wasn't sorry at all. But we have urgent business that cannot wait. His eyes flicked to Clara briefly, dismissive. Mrs. Crowford, he said, offering a slight nod. Mr. Langford, Clara replied coolly. Nathaniel hesitated, conflict clear in his expression. Go, Clara said quietly. I'll be fine. Nathaniel looked torn, but duty won, as it always did. I'll find you later, he promised. He walked away with Silas, their heads bent together in conversation. Clara watched them disappear back toward the house. She stood alone in the overgrown garden, surrounded by her mother-in-law's forgotten roses, and she felt the distance opening up again. That night, Nathaniel didn't come to dinner. Clara ate with Lillian, trying to focus on her sister's stories about home, about their mother, about the small kindnesses the monthly stipend had allowed. But her mind kept drifting. What had Silas wanted? Why had Nathaniel looked so tense when his partner appeared? After Lillian went to bed, Clara wandered the house restlessly. She told herself she was just walking, just exploring, but somehow her feet carried her to the hallway outside Nathaniel's study. The door was slightly ajar. Light spilled out into the darkened corridor. She heard voices, angry voices. Clara knew she should leave, knew she shouldn't listen, but she couldn't move. You can't keep covering for mistakes, Nathaniel, Silas said, his voice sharp. I'm not asking you to cover anything, Nathaniel replied, his tone dangerous. I'm asking for time. Time, Silas laughed bitterly. The investors are getting nervous. They want results, profits. And if they find out about certain irregularities, there are no irregularities, Nathaniel interrupted. Aren't there? Silas's voice dropped lower, more menacing. What about the Hawthorne girl? Clara's blood turned to ice. What about her? Nathaniel's voice was quiet, too quiet. Come on, Nathaniel. Everyone knows her father was involved in that railroad fraud 2 years ago. The debts, the gambling, the falsified investment documents. If word gets out that you married into that family, that you're connected to that scandal, Silas paused, it'll destroy your reputation. Everything you've built. Clara pressed her hand against the wall, her heart pounding so hard she thought they might hear it. Clara had nothing to do with her father's mistakes, Nathaniel said firmly. Doesn't matter, Silas replied. Perception is everything in this business. You know that better than anyone, and right now the perception is that you made a foolish, sentimental decision. Silence. I'll handle it, Nathaniel said finally. You'd better, because if you don't, I will. Footsteps approached the door. Clara stepped back quickly, pressing herself into the shadows of an alcove. Silas emerged from the study, his face tight with anger. He strode past without seeing her, his footsteps echoing down the marble hallway. Clara waited, barely breathing. Through the open door she could see Nathaniel standing at his desk, his hands braced against the wood, his head bowed. He looked defeated. Clara wanted to go to him, wanted to tell him she'd heard everything, wanted to ask what he was hiding, what he was protecting, but fear held her frozen. Because if Nathaniel's empire was built on reputation, on perception, on untouchable perfection, then what would happen when the truth came out? What would happen when he discovered that Clara's father hadn't just been involved in that railroad fraud? He'd been at the center of it, and Clara had the documents to prove it, documents that could destroy Silas Langford, documents that could collapse the entire steel empire, documents she'd been hiding since the day she arrived. Clara sat on the edge of her bed, the locked trunk open at her feet. The envelope her father had given her 6 months before his death lay in her trembling hands. She'd carried it through everything, through his funeral, through the creditors, through the wedding, never opening it, never looking inside. Until now, she broke the seal. Inside were contracts, letters, telegrams, all meticulously organized. Her father's handwriting filled the margins, notes scrawled in desperate haste, railroad investment scheme, Langford Enterprises, falsified projections, investor fraud, and at the bottom, a ledger page with 3 names, Silas Langford, Jonathan Mercer, William Ashford. Clara's hands shook as she read her father's final note. They made me the scapegoat. I'm already dying. Protect yourself. Use this only if you must. Her father had been innocent. A pawn, sacrificed to protect 3 powerful men. And Silas Langford had orchestrated everything. A knock at the door made her jump. Clara, Nathaniel's voice. She shoved the papers back into the envelope, her heart racing. Come in. Nathaniel entered, his face drawn. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Did you read them? He asked quietly. Clara stared at him. How did you know? I've known since the wedding, Nathaniel said. Your father's attorney contacted me before he died, told me about the documents, asked me to protect you. Clara felt the world tilt. You knew, her voice cracked. You knew my father was innocent and you said nothing. I didn't know he was innocent, Nathaniel said carefully. I knew there were documents. I knew Silas was involved somehow, but I didn't have proof. He stepped closer. May I see them? Clara handed him the envelope with shaking hands. Nathaniel read through everything methodically. She watched his expression shift. Surprise, anger, and finally something colder. Acceptance. I suspected, he said finally, but I didn't want to believe it. You knew Silas was a fraud and you stayed partners with him. Clara's voice rose. I knew there were irregularities in the railroad deal. I knew something felt wrong, but Silas covered his tracks well. Nathaniel looked at her. By the time I realized the extent of it, your father was already dead. And without proof, accusing Silas would have destroyed everything. So you let everyone believe my father was the criminal, Clara said bitterly. You let my family suffer. I didn't know it was your father until I saw his name on the debt records, Nathaniel said. And by then, I thought I could help you another way. By marrying you, by protecting your family. You married me to bury the truth, Clara whispered. No. Nathaniel's voice was firm. I married you because I thought I could keep you safe from whatever fallout was coming. He gestured to the documents. These papers prove Silas committed fraud. They prove he manipulated investors, falsified records, destroyed lives. If you take them to the authorities, he'll be arrested. His assets seized. Nathaniel paused, his eyes meeting hers. And because his money is tied to mine, because we're partners, the entire empire will collapse. Every employee will lose their jobs. Every investor will lose their money, including the funds supporting your mother and sister. Clara felt sick. So I have a choice, she said slowly. Destroy Silas and destroy everything, or protect a criminal to save innocent people. Yes, Nathaniel said quietly. Clara stood, pacing the room. Her mind raced through possibilities, consequences, futures that branched in different directions. There's another option, she said finally. Nathaniel looked at her. What? You buy out Silas's share of the company. Completely. Sever all ties. With what money? Nathaniel asked. That would cost millions. Money I don't have liquid. You have the Blackmore Heights property, Clara said. The land alone is worth millions. Sell it. Nathaniel's face went pale. That's been in my family for 3 generations. It's also empty, Clara said gently. You said yourself you haven't been to the gardens in 20 years. Your mother's piano sat silent for 2 decades. You're holding on to ghosts, Nathaniel. She stepped closer to him. Sell the property. Buy out Silas. Then take these documents and give them to the authorities anonymously. Once he's no longer your partner, his crimes won't touch you or the company. Nathaniel was silent for a long moment. That would work, he said slowly. It would actually work. But you'd lose your family home, Clara said softly. Nathaniel looked at her, really looked at her, and Clara saw something break open in his expression. I lost my home when my mother died, he said quietly. I've just been living in a museum since then. He reached out, taking her hands in his. You're right, it's time to let go. 6 weeks later, Clara stood in the courthouse, watching Silas Langford being led away in chains. The documents had been delivered anonymously, but they'd been devastating. Fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy. The charges went on and on. Nathaniel had dissolved their partnership 3 weeks earlier, buying out Silas's shares with money from selling Blackmore Heights to a railroad company. The scandal had been enormous, but Nathaniel had weathered it, his reputation intact, because he'd acted swiftly and decisively. Clara felt Nathaniel's hand find hers. "It's over," he said quietly. "Is it?" Clara asked. "The contract is," Nathaniel said. "1 year ends today. You're free to go. The money is already in your account." Clara turned to look at him. "And if I don't want to go?" Nathaniel's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that somewhere in the last year, this stopped being about a contract," Clara said. "You gave me your mother's music room. You welcomed my sister. You trusted me with the truth about Silas." She squeezed his hand. "You let me see who you really are, and I want to stay." "Clara," Nathaniel's voice was rough with emotion, "I can't promise you romance. I don't know how to be that man. I don't need romance," Clara said. "I need honesty, partnership, someone who sees me as an equal." She smiled. "And someone who'll let me play piano whenever I want." Nathaniel laughed. Actually laughed. The sound was rusty but real. "I think I can manage that." He pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers. "I bought a smaller house," he said. "In the city, near the park. I thought we could start fresh. Build something new." "We?" Clara whispered. "If you'll have me," Nathaniel said. "Not as a contract, as a husband, a real one." Clara felt tears on her cheeks. "Yes," she said. "Yes." Nathaniel kissed her then, soft and careful and full of promise. When they pulled apart, Clara saw reporters gathering outside the courthouse. "They're going to ask questions," Nathaniel said. "Let them," Clara replied. She thought of her father, of the truth finally revealed, of the empire that had nearly destroyed them both, now rebuilt on honesty instead of secrets. As they walked down the courthouse steps together, a reporter called out, "Mrs. Crowford, is it true you provided the evidence against Silas Langford?" Clara stopped. She looked at Nathaniel. He nodded. She turned to the reporter. "It was always me," she said clearly. "I had the documents all along, and when it mattered most, I chose truth over silence." The reporters erupted with questions, but Nathaniel guided her through the crowd to their waiting carriage. As they drove away, Clara looked back at the courthouse one last time. Silas Langford's empire had collapsed, but from the ruins, something better had grown. A partnership built on truth, a marriage built on choice, a future built on hope. Clara leaned against Nathaniel's shoulder, his arm wrapped around her. "No more secrets?" she asked. "No more secrets," Nathaniel promised. And for the first time since arriving at Crowford Manor 1 year ago, Clara felt truly free. Not because the contract had ended, but because she'd finally found where she belonged.